This is Bill Nell speaking. Welcome to the truth about the Philadelphia experiment. You're about to experience an amazing story. It's a story that I've spent many years investigating. I like to call this part of the presentation the interview. It was filmed in 1989, but that doesn't make it any less relevant. In fact, it's become more relevant. A number of other witnesses have come forward since that time to verify the information that you'll see here. The interview comprises two stories that are intertwined: the Philadelphia experiment and the Montauk project. The Philadelphia experiment had several purposes. It began as a World War II Navy project to demagnetize ships against a new type of German mine that was attracted to the magnetized metal of vessels. The degaussing of ships tended to be an arduous process in those days, and it involved a stay in dry dock, and most of the electronic equipment on board a ship had to be removed while it was being degaussed. This was a method that was really impractical for wartime use. The creation of a strong field of some type that could be controlled to instantly demagnetize ships proved to be a much better idea. Each ship could be provided with the necessary equipment that would be carried on board at all times, so that the degaussing process could take place at any time. Although the degaussing aspect of the Philadelphia experiment was promising and important, it was in no way the end game. The second and more important goal of the Philadelphia experiment was to make Navy ships invisible to radar. It's no secret that the Germans were developing powerful radar systems in those days that could track ships from a great distance. In fact, by 1942, plans were already underway to equip new German multipurpose aircraft with radar-guided bombs. Information obtained after the war proved this fact to be true. The scientists and engineers that developed the technology for the Philadelphia experiment saw the degaussing work as a way to get their feet in the door with the military. They had ideas that went far beyond degaussing and radar invisibility, but the demagnetizing project allowed them access to government officials and government money. With a potential price tag of millions of dollars for what they really had in mind, they needed time to explain and prove their ideas to the military. The Navy was the perfect start. President Franklin Roosevelt had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President Woodrow Wilson and was appointed to that position in 1913. Now, as president, he was known to have a great deal of respect and affection for the Navy. He'd certainly be interested in anything that would help military vessels evade U-boats and enemy ships. You'll hear more about the history of the experiment during the interview, but the end game for the scientists and engineers involved was complete invisibility and more. With a one-time chance at millions of dollars in government money that would likely go away after the war, they had a chance to take pet theories and ideas and turn them into reality. Knowing how notoriously skeptical naval officers were about new technologies and ideas, they had to prove that the ideas could work, and did so by staging demonstrations and tests over a period of time. Not all the tests went well, as you'll see, and it was obvious that more control over the new technology was needed, but the scientists and engineers involved produced results that the Navy could not ignore. The Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton University in New Jersey was the home of most of the scientists and engineers involved with the Philadelphia experiment. Einstein made his home at the Institute and is said to have been involved directly with the experiment. It's a historical fact that he was under contract to the Department of the Navy during World War II. The work he did for them remains secret. Other great minds, like John von Neumann and Nikola Tesla, were also involved. A number of the prodigies who worked with these great minds also worked on the Philadelphia experiment. I tend to believe that the entire saga began because these prodigies urged Einstein and others that they worked for to pursue the practical application of theories they developed at the Institute by contacting the military. If these theories could be proven true, there could be a chance at millions of dollars in government money, and actually this would be a chance for the prodigies to establish their own reputations and their own areas of development using those much-needed government funds. With the nearby Philadelphia Naval Shipyard and its assets placed at their disposal, things moved forward to the point where sea trials of the technology were planned and carried out in the early 1940s. During one of these trials, a hyperspace portal, or window, or stargate if you will, was opened, which transported two of the sailors from the test ship to another place in space and time. That place was the Montauk base, where the technology originally developed from the Philadelphia experiment was now being used on even more advanced and bizarre projects, as you'll soon see. The time was the 1980s, and the place was the eastern end of Long Island, near the historic Montauk Lighthouse. There's a great deal more to this story, and I'll allow the interview participants to fill in the blanks for you. And you'll certainly want to listen carefully because it's quite a story. When I first went to this special event, I must say I was skeptical and ready not to believe most of what was going to be said, simply because it didn't fit into what I thought about technology and government and things of that nature, even though I've been a paranormal investigator for many years and investigated a number of outrageous UFO claims, some true, some not. But I did approach it as objectively as possible. And in fact, as you'll see, I brought people with me to help verify these claims. But let me give you a little bit of information about the people that were involved in this interview session. Let's begin with Preston Nichols. He was born on Long Island, New York, in 1946. He has degrees in parapsychology, psychology, and electrical engineering. Preston worked for most of his life in defense electronics and wound up at Brookhaven National Labs and AIL. In 1968, Preston's involvement with Montauk began. He got involved with the tail end of stealth research at AIL. Preston was told that the research started right after the Philadelphia experiment. He actually read the final report of Project Rainbow, which was what was known as the Philadelphia experiment in those days. The report named the Cameron brothers as being the Navy liaison in the experiment. Next, he got pulled into the Mind Sciences project at Montauk. They were working on interfacing a person's mind to a computer. Preston worked with Al Bielek on the psychic aspects of the Montauk Chair and the Montauk Boys program. Preston trained the Montauk Boys to be PSI warriors. The Montauk Chair used subtle quantum fields to read a person's thoughts. The psychic would lay in the chair, go into a trance, and a group of coils picked up the emanations. A bank of radio receivers designed by Tesla could pick up and digitize the thought, turning thought into computer code. The radar tower was used to turn thought into reality. This chair was used for many purposes. One was to open up a vortex for time travel. Many Montauk boys were lost due to the initial testing of the time vortex. Now let me introduce you to Al Bielek. Al Bielek has led a life that most would not choose to lose. While many would think that time travel, meeting aliens, and working on secret projects are exciting ventures, Al paid a big price for the privilege. Because those who set the agenda wished to keep their activities secret, Al was robbed of his family, his memories, and ultimately his identity. They used advanced technologies to erase what was dear to him. However, their technologies were not perfect. Slowly but surely, the memories came back to Al. Al started meeting others who had been through the same process, and ultimately a flood of memories returned that would allow him to tell his story in his own words. Al has been involved for many years in electrical engineering. Duncan Cameron is one of the central figures in the Philadelphia experiment and Montauk Project saga. According to Al, Duncan was his brother when Al was Ed Cameron, who jumped off the USS Eldridge in 1943 and landed into the future. When they wound up in 1982 or 83 at Montauk, they were both sent back to the USS Eldridge to destroy the equipment that was keeping the ship in hyperspace. Al Bielek says that before the Eldridge rematerialized, Duncan jumped back off the ship and returned back to 1983. He was used extensively as a psychic in the Montauk project. He became one of the principal psychics who manned the Montauk chair. The chain was used to create and hold the frequency required to perform the time travel and mind control activities. If this plot, if you will, sounds suspiciously like the theatrical movie, The Philadelphia Experiment, it should. It's thought that the movie came out at a time and was produced at a time when basically the story of Montauk was going to come out anyway, because despite all the brainwashing techniques that were being used and thought masks, some of the people remembered. And what a great way to have plausible denial if a movie were to come out before anyone talked, and the movie was obviously portrayed as a fictional story, so that anyone telling a story after that would be thought to be claiming something that was nothing but pure fiction. The interview was filmed by me in the Long Island home of a friend of Preston and Al. With strange cargo vans circling the neighborhood while the session was conducted, on a chilly day after Thanksgiving in 1989, and lots of nervous participants, I filmed as best I could without special lighting or anything that might detract those present from the task at hand. I was able to use microphones placed near those that were involved, so the sound quality isn't bad. Among those present at this sort of micro event were a small, specially invited group of paranormal researchers, psychics, and journalists. A friend of mine who wrote a number of technical manuals, including some for the space shuttle, and also worked in the defense industry, was there to provide me with verification of the technological claims by Preston and Al. Not only did he verify it, but hearing the story kept him up for days afterward and made him wonder why he and others working on government contracts were not allowed access to this amazing technology.
Thank Preston, Al, and Cameron for being here tonight. Really, I mean, for all of us eccentrics, we are thoroughly pleased to hear about the Rainbow Project, the Philadelphia Experiment, the Phoenix Project, all that good stuff. And so I guess you can all take it the way you want, as one after another, while he puts on his sunglasses. And this is really, I think, a memorable event. And so you guys can take on the project, and thanks for being here. Go ahead.
Well, Preston, why don't you start? Yeah. All right. Well, we're here tonight. We have with us Mr. Bielek, who is from the Eldridge for the Philadelphia Experiment, the older fellow that went back to 43. We also have with us Mr. Cameron, who is also off the Eldridge. Two of the craziest people in the world.
Now, compliment.
They're not so crazy, they survived. We're here at the auspices of the, what's it, Galuppi?
Yeah, Filippo Galuppi.
Galuppi brothers.
Right.
We're here in this nice, beautiful home in Blue Point. This home has to be at least $250,000.
I hope so. Three-quarter.
Or $750,000, whatever. And I don't know what we're going to talk about.
Why don't you start with what Montauk was about, how it tied into the Philadelphia Experiment.
A brief synopsis, maybe, of the...
Okay, first of all, I got to find the power cord.
You want to start with Philadelphia and then go to however you want.
How it ties in?
I first have to find the power cord. I got a place to plug this power cord and start up the tape recorder.
Go.
There, plugged in. All right, way back when. Let's start with the Phoenix Project. Phoenix Project is a carry-on from the Philadelphia Experiment. That was a...
Can you hear them? Can you hear them okay?
That was a silly little project that the Navy did back in the 30s and the 40s, attempting to make a battleship invisible. They wanted to make an aircraft carrier invisible. They threw the switch one eventful day, and the ship went into hyperspace, caused all sorts of problems for the people on the boat. Navy said the thing's a huge failure, it's a huge success, but it's also a huge failure, and they shelved it. In about 47, it was decided, the government can't leave this thing alone. They got a wild effect that they wanted to study. So in 47, they reopened it and started up with what we came later to know as the Phoenix Project. It was originally the Rainbow Project. It was moved to Brookhaven National Laboratories, and Dr. von Neumann and all his associates, this was long before any of us were involved in it, started to replicate this thing. Out of the Phoenix 1, the early project, came the stealth technology, which I cannot talk about. Either of these two guys could talk about the stealth technology, but I cannot talk about it because of my job. And also came out all sorts of energetic little toys, such as radio songs. What is a radio song? Well, if you remember all back when we were kids, we saw these little white plastic boxes that had a white bottle hanging down on it that they connected to a little red parachute, filled up a balloon with helium, connected the whole thing, and up in the atmosphere it went. The government told us, hey, this thing is a weather data package. It has a temperature sensor, has a humidity sensor, and it has a pressure sensor in it. And this thing will alternately transmit temperature data, humidity data, temperature data, reference data. And the switching was controlled by the barometric pressure at the height by what they call the baro switch. This thing used a very unusual type of pulse modulation. In most cases, they used a CW, continuous wave oscillator, and pulsed the thing off. The pulse was pulsing it off. This turned out to be a very efficient conversion of electrical energy to etheric energy. Now, I very recently started collecting radio songs. I don't know why, but I did. I walked in with a radio song, and one of the associates at Space-Time Laboratory says, things are a weather control device. So, of course, that piqued my interest. I'd already known that the humidity sensor was terrible. Its accuracy was a lot to be desired. I'd known the temperature sensor was terrible, and its accuracy had a lot to be desired. And the other unusual thing that I wondered about is, I can get all the radio sounds I want. I've never, ever seen a receiver for them. So, we first did a quote-unquote psychic reading. See, at Space-Time Laboratories, everybody uses CAD, computer-aided designs. At Space-Time Laboratories, we use psychic-aided design. So we had a number of different psychics read on the radio songs. Weather control device, doorbuster, Orgone enhancer. That's the readings that came through. So I got very interested, and I started to ask around about radio songs. The next thing I found out by word of mouth is these things were designed at Brookhaven National Laboratories up in Long Island, New York, just up the road from this place. And I started to talk to people I know at Brookhaven. Ran across a retired gentleman from Brookhaven who wishes to remain nameless, so I won't name him. He'll stay anonymous. He told me that the design was originally done by a character by the name of Wilhelm Reich. Of course, that piqued my interest even more. Wilhelm Reich. The story goes that in about 47, Mr. Reich handed the U.S. government a weather control device. A little package that would do door busting. He felt that if he could reduce the amount of door and increase the orgone in the storm wouldn't be violent, it wouldn't have winds, and it wouldn't do the damage. It would be a less violent storm.
What is the DOR?
Deadly orgone. Dead orgone. That's the bad stuff.
And where does that come from?
No one really knows where it comes from. I've heard a number of theories. Well, essentially, orgone can be considered like life energy, energy from life forces, energy from living beings. Dead orgone is same type of energy but dead. It doesn't have any life in it. It has a tendency to decrease life functions. It reduces life functions. So the government took this little widget that Mr. Wright handed them. He told them, put it on a balloon, send it up. Of course, they put a parachute on it because they didn't want the thing coming down with a big, loud, crashing bang through somebody's skylight, and the government gets sued for all sorts of money. And they send the thing up into a bad storm, and it gets reduced in intensity tremendously. So the government goes back to Reich and says, hey, we like the thing. So they launch another part of the Phoenix Project where they design these radio songs. This is almost like a little subsection of this, by the way, this story. Now, of course, I dug further and further into it. As I already noted, I talked of the receiver. There are instances where we know they launched these things from every boat at sea, every airport, every weather station. They launched them from planes. At one point in the 50s, there must have been maybe 200 to 500 of these things launched every day. The radio range, being a radio person, I can tell you about that. I checked it. The radio range on these transmitters, even up in the air, maybe is 100 miles. So that means when they launch one of these frequencies, there had to be a receiver close by. They're going to send up a data transmitter and now have, they have to have a receiver. That means if they're sending 200 or more of these things up each day, it's got to be one pile of receivers. These receivers should be very common. Now, I happen to be a receiver collector. I have over 100 receivers in my personal collection of receivers. I have never seen a radio sound receiver. I've heard them, but I've never seen one. I got almost every other receiver that was used in the 40s and the 50s by the military.
I have a question. What is the center frequency without modulation on the radio sound transmitter?
403 megahertz and 1680 megahertz. They use two different frequencies.
They're both on simultaneously?
Huh?
They're both on simultaneously?
No, it's one or the other.
One for primary and one for secondary?
No, it's one transmitter or the other transmitter that's in the package. The early ones are on 403. The later ones,
exactly?
plus or minus 2 megahertz. And the later ones are on 1680, plus or minus about 6 megahertz.
They were crystal tuned or?
No, they were just free running oscillators.
Free running oscillators.
The 400 megahertz, I was going to get into the details, the technical details, how the radio sound worked. All right, this is a good time to go into that. I don't have any illustrative materials, so I'll have to attempt to describe to you people how the circuitry worked. It's a very unique system that they had. Essentially, the temperature element was a thermistor type. It is a negatively varying resistance with the temperature. As the resistance goes up, as the temperature goes up, the resistance goes down. Now, I had a mass spectrograph done on one of these thermistors, and I compared it to a YSI thermistor. And they both have carbon in them. They both are essentially carbon, but the Radiosonde thermistor had some silver in it, had some gold in it, had some platinum in it, had some iridium. I'm trying to remember the other two elements it had. It has a fair amount of silver in it. Silver was about 10% by weight. Now, for a thermistor, it's not going to make it any more accurate. If anything, it's going to make the curve go really strange. You're doping it with metals like that. Of course, you read Wilhelm Reich literature, you'll find out Reich used sensors that had gold and silver in them. So that's one interesting note there. The humidity element is a plastic plate with silvered edges with a grid of conductive lines going across the plastic plate. You know, this way and this way. You know, this way, this way, this way, this way, this sort of thing. They put on it a very odd mix of chemicals. The chemistry lab has not come back yet what the mix of chemicals is they put on it. Now, the unusual thing about the temperature, the humidity element, is most electrolytic resistors I've ever seen, the resistance goes down as they get damp. These things, the resistance goes up as they get damp. Now, what we're theorizing at this point, which we've proven from the esoteric side, we have no physical data to back it up, is that the thermistor rod, the temperature sensor, the temperature rod, acts like an antenna for the door. It acts like a door antenna out of phase. That's the dead orgone. The humidity sensor acts as an antenna for the orgone. Of course, this parallels the whole idea of, you'll see in esoteric circles, people use salt water solutions with different electrodes in them to detect these energetics, with a fair degree of success. Looks like here, Wright took it much further. Now, the pressure sensor is essentially what they call a barrow switch, or a pressure-sensitive cycling switch. As the thing would rise, the pressure would change, and the needle in the little barometer would go across a switch segment, hit the segments of a switch. That drove a relay that would in sequence put either the temperature or the humidity sensor back and forth. It would switch between these two sensors. Then it would switch to, which I'll explain in a minute how it's done, to what they call a reference mode in the transmitter. So what they have, as this thing rises and goes above the earth, it transmits a signal that destroys the door, and also transmits a signal after that, or before, however you look at it, that builds up the orgone energies. Now, let's consider the transmitter. The transmitter is a very interesting little beast. It is two oscillators. An oscillator that runs at the carrier frequency, the 403 megahertz or 1680 megahertz. There's a second oscillator, which is a 7 megahertz oscillator coupled into the grid of the carrier oscillator. Now, the control grid of the modulation oscillator, the 7 megahertz oscillator, has an RC network that causes it to do the relaxation number. Now, as the oscillator runs, it builds up DC across the grid when the capacitor that's in the RC network for the relaxation oscillator. I have to apologize, I don't have any schematics with me. I didn't expect to talk of this, but there was interest at the table. As that capacitor would build up high enough in charge to put a high negative bias on the grid of the tube, cut the tube off, the oscillator would stop oscillating, of course. The RC network would discharge and pull the voltage down on the capacitor, just like a neon bulb oscillator. So essentially, that 7 megahertz oscillator would pulse on and off. Now, the lower the resistance, the faster the pulsing would be, and the higher resistance, the slower the pulsing would be. I'm trying to make this as clear as I can without having a schematic to point out. I don't know, are the two people here following what I'm saying that have some technical background? Now, they did not couple the 7 megahertz directly into the grid of the carrier oscillator. It couples in through an RC network where the first resistor is in series with the plate coils. Between the B plus and the B plus end of the plate coil, they have a capacitor going to ground, a bypass capacitor that integrates the function. Then they RC couple with a series capacitor and a resistor going to ground on the oscillator of the carrier oscillator. Well, what happened, whenever the modulation oscillator would click in, turn on, it would cut off the carrier oscillator and shut it off. Of course, etheric signals are already differentiated, so it means when you put the differentiated signal through the integrated network, it comes out in its real form in that final amplifier, that final oscillator.
Wouldn't that circuit also attenuate the instantaneous spike? In other words, that is a de-emphasis network.
Yes,
That was the intent, wasn't it? primary oscillator in the
We don't know
RC?
what the intent was behind it. That's what it appears to be. It's an integrator, which is a de-emphasis.
Right.
A differentiator is your emphasis network. You're thinking of. See, in engineering, as a technician, you talk of de-emphasis and emphasis. In engineering, we talk of integration and differentiation. And being trained in that's what I talk of. So the etheric signal or the hyperspatial signal, the orgone is already differentiated. It can't do anything. It's 90 degrees out of phase to begin with. This integration network brings it back in phase for the transmitter to transmit it. Now, also, you have to keep in mind that when the tube goes from a semi-saturated mode, as it is when the carrier oscillator is oscillating the cutoff, there are other things taking place from the zero-point potential. When the tube is cut off, any of the etheric signal that's stored in the tube will be pushed out the antenna. Also, when you cut the tube off, and you go from saturation to cutoff, and from cutoff to saturation again, you're essentially ripping open the vacuum from the viewpoint of the Dirac space that he derived in the 30s. And you'll get an amplification. If these transmitters only put out about a half a watt of CW RF power, the etheric content or the non-real power was equivalent to about a 250 watt transmitter. That's how efficient these little things were.
Can you describe the phase relationship between the RF output power and the etheric power and the frequency difference between the two?
Okay, the frequency should be the same. The phase relationship...
Cosine? Would it be a cosine function?
Let's see, what would it be? It would have to be, it would come out of the differential equation relating the baseband to the carrier frequency. I think it'd be a tangent. I think it's a tangent function.
So it would rise sharply.
Yeah.
Until the next cycle.
Mm-hmm. That tells you that sends out the etherics in bursts. In other words, when this transmitter runs, the CW part of it, when the oscillator is on, it doesn't put out much etherics. But at the point where the oscillator shuts off, it sends out a huge burst of etheric signal. That's your tangent function. I just had to think for a minute of what it would be, the question, answer your question.
I have a totally different question. Who was in charge of this project, of the doorbusters? What department of the government?
This was under United University's Brookhaven National Labs. It was eventually turned over to the Signal Corps. Because most of these things were U.S. Army Signal Corps stuff. Even the one set up from the Weather Service was Signal Corps. So Signal Corps had ultimate charge of it.
So as you're talking about this whole system, how does that now get into what was happening in the 40s and the 80s?
Okay, let's finish this off a little. Where was I? Questions always break a train of thought.
You were describing basically the system of the doorbusters.
All right, the government could not tell the public that these things were weather control devices. They were keeping that secret. How'd they guard the secret? Two ways. They first showed a few receiving stations constructed to receive these things, put out that line. The personnel that launched them would laboriously calibrate them. Thirdly, the special tube that's in the radiosondes, they would list in the tube manual as a whole bunch of baloney. Essentially, they'd be saying that only a few hours of life. That means if the ham over there picked one up, looked at the tube manual, a 7533 is only going to last a few hours, he's not going to use it. And that worked very well. As I already mentioned, I've never seen a receiver. That says they didn't use a receiver with these things. This is why, this is the hard data, besides the psychic data I base that the story is correct. All right, what we're seeing here actually is in actuality the genesis of the Montauk project. The Montauk project was Phoenix 2. The Montauk project is a combination of Wilhelm Reich's work in the Philadelphia experiment. It was like two separate little projects going on in Phoenix 1. You had the development of the invisibility and its human factor study. Also, you had the development of Wilhelm Reich's weather control.
So that was Phoenix 1?
Yeah, that's Phoenix 1, and they converged. towards the end of the Phoenix project, by using some of Wilhelm Reich's concepts and some of the modulation schemes gleaned from the Radioson project, coupling, I know you're looking puzzled, this is what I found last week. Coupling that to the equipment that was used on the boat in the later invisibility project, they found out to couple the two, you now could use this for mind control. I'm not saying mood alteration. I know Governor Circle would rather have me say mood alteration. Here, I'm calling a spade of a spade. Mind control. That's what these idiots were doing. They're not actually idiots. That's what these people were doing.
That's what the Montauk project was?
No, the Phoenix 1.
The Phoenix 1.
The end of Phoenix 1, of course, what happened? Congress, the political government heard, hey, these guys are playing with mind control. They don't want that. So they told them, hey guys, cut it out. We don't want you looking into mind control. That's a no-no. So, of course, the project was stopped. It was shut down. Does anyone here think it was really shut down? No, of course not. The people that were running this project went to the military and said, hey, we got this neat little project going. We can eventually use this to influence the mind of the enemy to give up and to surrender. We need a place to do this. We got to do this undercover now. So, of course, the military, they love the idea. You know, they love something, throw a switch and the enemy puts down all their weapons and comes up hands in the air. They love this. So the military was sold a bill of goods. And the military was said, okay, you can use the old Montauk Air Force Base. It's dead, it's derelict. Also, some of the equipment you requested is on that base, the old Sage radar. So the base was shut down, everything was auctioned off, but the Sage radar was left behind. And the whole group moved from the Brookhaven Labs out to Montauk. That's Phoenix 2. Of course, they spent the first 10 years, from about 1969 to about 1979, researching pure mind control. They started out by taking the output of the Sage radar, modulating it to special ways that they came up with that Reich had shown them from the weather control process, and combining that with stuff they noticed from the Philadelphia experiment work and the stealth work. And they were hitting these poor bastards with the microwave beam out of the Sage transmitter direct. Sage transmitter transmitted at about 400 megahertz, 406 megahertz, I believe most of the time it was set at. It would hop around frequency a little. It would change in phase. It was pulse modulated. They used the amplidyne concept where you had many stages pulse modulated. Each one was pulse slightly different to build a form in the final stage.
Do you know a specific pulse width or frequency of pulse width?
VRF was anywhere from 10 cycles to about 750 cycles. The pulse width, depending upon how they loaded up the capacitors, the voltage could be varied anywhere from about 10 microseconds to about 75 microseconds. The center frequency was 406 megahertz, generated from a stay-low type function, which was referenced from a zero-time function.
Was there any other modulation on this, phase modulation, frequency?
There was phase modulation, there was frequency hopping on it. Now this is as I saw it when I got on the station. I'm first trying to account what our digging and psyching and digging and talking to different people told us was the genesis of this thing. Let's keep all the technical questions till later. Okay?
But let me straighten out the chronology. Phoenix 2, then it would start in 1969?
Yeah, about 69, 70, 71, somewhere in there.
Phoenix 1 went from basically from World War
48
II
to 68.
to 68.
Now, essentially, the first part of the mind control project was to take an individual, such as Duncan here, stand them maybe, 250 feet away from that antenna. As I was starting to go into what the Sage radar was capable of. The Sage radar had a peak pulse power of a half a megawatt. That's in the antenna. The antenna had a gain of 30 dB. So that means you're a megawatt. It has a peak pulse power, effective radiated power of at least a gigawatt. This is nominally a gigawatt. Can you imagine what that would do to people? I think it's amazing that the people are still here today that have been hit with this. It does such things as burn out brains, functions, and neurological damage. And you look inside of a person's lung that had this done, it'll look like their lung is all scarred from the heat generated, and it just goes on with physical damage done to the body by this sort of thing. They tried this with a number of people, a few survivors, in this sort of thing.
Where they get the volunteers for this?
They were just grabbing indigenous people off the street and throwing them in front of the radar beam, and let's see what happens. That's the sort of nonsense that the government loves to do.
Who was in charge of the project at this time? It was covered now.
Mr. Jack Pruitt was in charge. All right.
Along with Dr. John Van Neumann.
In any particular agency?
I'm not sure what the agency was. Now, somebody got the brilliant